love riding my bike. I love running. I don't care what they think about it. I love it.
At that point, when I knew I was going to win, chills just went up and down my entire body.
I don't believe there are any good or bad foods. Food is food.
I still feel so passionate about getting that record that I'm like, I'm just going to do it.
As an athlete, I was like, what's my story, or what's your story? What can you learn from it? And what can you teach people?
Welcome to the IronWomen podcast. I'm Alyssa Godesky here with my co-host, Haley Chura. And Haley, whoa, we are in the end of May. I have 8 days left before I find out if I can start weight bearing again on my knee, which is very exciting. So in some ways, time is flying. In some ways, time is crawling. How are things out in Bozeman for you right now?
They're finally getting better. The weather.
I feel like you had snow
mostly
last week. Did I see that?
I had snow on Wednesday, like
yeah.
5 inches of wet, horrible snow. Like it was horrible. I was so bummed. And I don't know if this happens to you, but like sometimes even on a day like that, I was planning to run on the treadmill anyway. But the problem is like, getting there was so wet and gross because I bike commute because it has to be way worse than that for me to drive. And then I get there, it's like a little more crowded than usual, which is fine. I like people working out. That's why I go to the gym. I like people working out around me. But then it was also just like hotter than usual in the gym, I think, because sometimes when it's cold outside like that, they overcompensate indoors. And I know this happens in hot places too with air conditioning. And so, in colder climates, sometimes the opposite happens with heat. And so the gym was just so hot. And then the pool closed, the outdoor pool, because it was snowing, even though I thought that was the video I actually wanted to make was
swimming
in the snow, but
no luck. Shoot.
Close. The lifeguards were not having it. I did swim the next day, and this pool is like a hot tub, the pool that I swim in. And so it's kind of like horrible because you jump in when it is like 40 degrees Fahrenheit out and it feels like amazing. And you're like, oh, this is amazing right now, but it's probably not going to be good in like a minute. And then the other problem is that like everyone stays in the pool and like just chats. So like you're waiting to get you're trying to get laid.
Another sign that the pool is too warm is there's a lot of chatter.
Right. With like 40-degree air. So like the air is very cold. But like, it's also, that's the problem. Like getting out is cold. And so everyone just like is standing around chatting in the pool because it's like a hot tub and it's like social. I mean, it's like the one time I've ever wished I was an aqua jogger because it would be like perfect for aqua
jogging season. Yeah.
But it has reopened since then. And today, Alyssa, it was so beautiful. I planted some flowers. So,
ooh, okay. What kind of flowers did you plant?
Some petunias and some geraniums mostly. And just like, I like the bright colors, and I have like a tiny little patio and then one little basket out in the front, and it just makes me happy. In the morning when I'm like making coffee and I can look out there. I planted the flowers and I like cleaned my window.
Oh, the window washing phenomenon. So maybe this happened while I was growing up in like the mid-Atlantic, and I just never paid attention when my parents would like clean the windows. But Matt is like a big spring, like fall, like take the screens in and out and then like clean the windows when he does it. And it makes like a huge difference to like the living situation. It's like the best when he decides to do it. And like, yeah, it's really nice. And I'm very appreciative of that every time he does that chore.
It makes a huge difference. And especially like certain windows I have, or like the sliding glass door, like Cowboy, puts his face to it a lot. Yeah. And so there, it's kind of cute. Like the marks on there. But it's like, I can see my flowers so much better. So things are for sure looking up. Like we're trending in the right direction. I feel like I've been saying that like for 6 months, but it's been pretty good. How about in Vermont / rehab land? I don't want to say, are you back at Big Booty Land? That's your gym. Are you back there yet? Are you?
So
any complaints?
I am going to Big Booty Land and doing upper body only stuff. So I like sit on the bench and I'm like up against a cable machine, and we can kind of like move the cables and I can do various circuits that way. And then like they'll hand me dumbbells or something. So it's not very exciting, but it does get me out of the house. And It has, I will say, this round of being on crutches is like way easier because crutching around is really hard on your upper body. And so I will say it's been like easy breezy crutching around lately, which is also good because Haley, right now I am solo parenting the two dogs for 2 weeks in these last 2 weeks of being non-weight bearing because Matt went to Namibia, which is in Africa. It's like a country in the southern part of Africa on the western coast. And he is racing an expedition race. So like a major heavy backpack race. It started, yes, so we're recording this on a Monday. It started on Sunday morning and they have to finish by Saturday. And so a lot of days of racing. He went out there obviously several days ahead of time. And then it takes several days to get home from there. So these last 2 weeks of non-weight bearing are all me and Haley. I think the dogs know when like they need to just be calmer and accept life as it is. And so they're being little angels, knock on wood right
Yay.
now.
What
And
good dogs.
yeah, and so it's so interesting though to like really be doing this and like I think I'm just living my life with the minimal amount of movement possible, which is really interesting because you get to see like how few clothes you really need to like exist, right? And to do things. And then like with food even, it's like, yeah, with just me, it's like such a drastic change from what like one meal will last me for like quite a while longer than it normally would, which is good. And so I'm getting by, time's passing. I try and plan like one activity a day, and then I'm spending a lot of time, of course, dot watching. And so as I talk to you now, it is Monday evening in Vermont, and then it is 10:30 p.m. in Namibia. And Matt is racing on Rootstock Racing's team. So our listeners will remember we've had Dr. Abby Purkis on several times, and she is racing. So Matt's racing with Abby, her husband Brent, and then another man, Mike Garrison, who's a longtime adventure racer, often races with Rootstock, that sort of thing. And as I speak, Haley, they are in a transition area. So they just came off this trek that was on, it was through the moonscape. So it looked like the moon, allegedly, the whole time. It looked really, really difficult. A lot of teams got lost. It took out like half of the teams, half of the 20 teams, like just started missing checkpoints and stuff. So
Like they're done. Like half of the teams
you can
are
still
done.
kind of go on. So like you miss a checkpoint, you can still go on, but you're no longer doing like the full course race, right? And so you immediately are like dropped in rank to like the other people who skipped that CP or something like that, right? So, but Rootstock, they got lost. It was like a long, harrowing day of dot watching for me as I'm watching them literally in these like sand dunes. And I can't imagine how hard this navigation is. It seems terribly challenging, but they made it through the 50-kilometer trek, which they started around, I want to say they started around this time yesterday. So I feel like it took them almost a day to do the 50 kilometers.
Oh.
It got up to 40 degrees Celsius during the day there. So that's 104 degrees of just like open desert sun. And they took a rest under a tree, it looked like, for a few hours in the middle of the day, which the race director was highly recommending teams do to like sleep through that really hot part and then hopefully get some steam to race at night. But I'm looking at their dot right now, Haley, and they were in the transition area and then it looks like they start moving. I was like, oh, they're getting on the bike for this big bike leg. And it seems like they have parked themselves at a restaurant called Going a Cone No Taste restaurant. So
This is
a
amazing. You could tell they're at a restaurant.
Oh yeah. 4.5-star restaurant in Namibia. It looks delicious, but it does say it's closed. So either they stayed open for the racers, which is highly probable that they knew, I mean, this is like the middle of nowhere otherwise. So I'm sure this is like a big, fanfare to have all these people there all of a sudden. But then the other, I mean, it could totally be closed and I see this picture of like picnic tables, right? So like it's a big picnic table restaurant. So they also could very well be sleeping on these picnic tables and like catching a nap that way, I could picture. So I'm excited to see which of these scenarios it is.
Because it is nighttime in Namibia right now when we're recording this. Like it would be
10:30
but
at
it
night.
does sound like
Yeah.
that's like the best time to be moving. If it's that hot during the day, you probably want to like keep moving
know.
during the night.
I know. I am hoping they're getting like burgers in them. These pictures of the
Yeah.
food there looks delicious. So I'm hoping they
4.5
are. They stayed
stars.
open. I know, right? Like what are the odds you would come across that in Namibia? So hopefully they get moving soon and then they are off on a pretty monster
they're-
bike leg. So
It sounds like if
yeah.
they hit all those checkpoints in the moonscape, that means they're in the top 10, right?
Yeah, it sounds so. The tracker here is like a little fuzzy, as you can imagine, and the rankings are a little fuzzy, but I would put them around 10th, I think, at this point. And I mean, Abby and Brent have been traveling all around the world. If you've listened to Abby and you want to follow what she's been doing this past year, there's a podcast called Roaming Roots you can search for and find. And she has been podcasting a little bit as her and Brent have been, they essentially like took sabbaticals from work and then have been traveling the world with their two children, Zoe and Simon. And it's super fun. It's really interesting. They like started in Africa, then went to Asia, and then kind of went over to Greece, and then now back into Africa and Namibia for the race. And so they've done so much traveling, and it's really cool to see how a family makes that happen. I mean, they were all literally carrying only heavy backpacks for the last 6 months, Haley. Heavy backpack.
Wait, what
living.
are Zoe and Simon doing while they adventure race?
Great question. So the race director is a friend of Abby's, and she like said, you guys need to come race. We'll watch Simon and Zoe while you race. And so we don't know what they're doing. Sometimes you see them in a photo.
Yeah, does a
and
race
like,
director have
out.
time?
Yeah.
to also, you should have said Max and Ramona too. It sounds like this race director would be like, just fine.
Just bring everyone. Yeah. I mean, it's really cool. I mean, I'm sure Zoe and Simon are having like the time of their lives, right? Because who wouldn't want to be kind of on this traveling caravan through Namibia?
Watching mom and dad suffer,
Yeah.
that would be amazing. And
I
being
know.
lost, and that would be amazing.
Yeah.
But very cool. I need to check out Roaming Roots. I'll check out that podcast and hear more about Abby's adventures. She is a treasured guest around here. So very, very cool to hear what she's up to. And I hope Matt, is having a good time. And
I saw a couple pictures. Yeah, there have been some signs. Finally, you scour all the images coming out of the race. And so you're like trying to, it looks like a lot of sand, like a lot of desert and sand. And you're looking at these pinpoint people, but finally we got some good close-up shots of maybe some smiles of them coming in. And so
this
it's
reminds
always
me
good to
of
see,
watching
like,
you at
life.
One Water.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it was like, and then when it was like, we're like, oh, it's Alyssa. And then it was like, oh man, that looks really hard. That was mostly the like when you get to actually see what it's like and you're like, oh my goodness. And they did an amazing coverage for that race, but very cool. Well, I can't wait to hear all the updates when Matt gets back from Africa. And I'm so glad that Max and Ramona are being good for you. And I'm excited. 8 days from now. So 2 shows. We might have an update on if you're weight bearing, hopefully we have lots of good news to share in the next couple of weeks. So lots of good things. And I guess if you're up all night tracking this weekend, you could also watch the all women's pro race in Hamburg. It is a championship.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And
yes.
so that will be kind of in the middle of the night for you, but you might be up anyway. You can you're just like tracking everyone all across the globe.
Just a career dot watcher. I know. It's like, I mean, someone's got to do it. So
yeah, I mean, I was listening to Lottie Vilms, who you had on last week, and where she was talking about the equality in races and how it is great that Ironman does still have a few of these races that are pro women only, and it helps make it a little bit more fair. So I think that that's very cool, and best of luck to everyone racing there. And yeah, Alyssa might be watching while she's like checking in on Namibia as well.
I know. They have to finish by, actually, that'll be great because I think they have to finish by probably about the time that Hamburg is starting. And so I'm just going to roll from one thing into the next and keep that train going. It'll be pretty fun.
Perfect.
Haley, our mailbag. So all of our mailbag questions lately have gone into a special show we will be recording for folks next week. It is a beginner kind of Q&A episode where we're going to tackle, if you're a beginner in triathlon, your burning questions, kind of give some advice and wisdom. I guess we have some of that wisdom for how to get started in the sport and just hopefully make it seem a little less intimidating. So we are skipping the mailbag segment for this week, but you can continue to send in other questions and we will either grab them for next week or we'll use them in a future episode. So you can always send those to ironwomenpodcast@gmail.com. And Haley, we have a super interesting interview for everyone today, right?
Yes. Today's guest is a little unorthodox for this podcast because while we do primarily feature women's voices on the show. Today's guest is a man, but he's also an expert in nutrition, including women's nutrition. So Scott Tindal is the co-founder of Fuelin nutrition coaching app. You might remember my conversation with Megan Foley, the pro triathlete, registered dietitian, and fellow Fuelin nutrition coach a few months ago. So Megan and I talked about a lot of different topics and trends in nutrition. But today, Scott and I are really only talking about women's nutrition. So we talk about a few new trends like fueling with your menstrual cycle. We talk about nutrition for performance, nutrition for weight loss. I asked on your behalf, Alyssa, I asked about nutrition advice when you're coming back from injury. So that one was just for you. And I mean, everyone, because unfortunately injuries are.
Me, Emma Coburn, Alicia Monson, all the other injured, really high profile people right now, right?
Yes. And so I got nutrition advice for all of you. And he also gave me a super easy formula to figure out how much protein active women like us should be eating each day. And it kind of blew my mind. So we'll have that full conversation with Scott right after a word from sponsors. Hi, Scott. Welcome to the IronWomen podcast.
I was going to say g'day, and then I thought, oh, well, that might get everyone offside. So hello, and thank you so much for having me.
We'll take any salutation, but I did mention this in the intro because it is a little rare for us to have a man on the show. And I've assured our listeners there's a good reason, and that you actually do have extensive experience and passion for working with women in endurance sports, which is, of course, what we all are and what we love. So I do want to start this conversation by asking you about a few of your recent success stories. I know you have a few you'd like to share.
Yeah, thank you. And just before we do get going, I just would like to say thank you so much for giving me an opportunity as a man on, I know, this podcast, which is very focused on women. And so I feel very honored to be able to chat with you today and hopefully explore some of the questions that you've got for me and hopefully provide some very practical information for your listeners. So thank you very much, Haley.
Thank you for being here.
Well, look, I think the first one that many people or many listeners are aware of, I think, is Holly Lawrence. And a lot of people were celebrating her third place in Miami, but I guess behind the scenes, we were celebrating the fact that she was pregnant before the race. And for us at Fuelin, and personally for myself, and obviously for Holly and Sean, it was such a big moment. And I think probably the biggest win in her career, really. I think for myself, it sort of really debunked that sort of myth that if you're an elite endurance female athlete, that you shouldn't have a cycle, and potentially getting pregnant is something that may be a distant thought. So I think when talking to Holly and the fact that she did get pregnant after performing, I guess, at very close to her peak and been performing at her peak for many, many years, I think it was probably the biggest win that we've had at Fuelin today.
Because this is 2016 70.3 world champion Holly Lawrence, who also has been vocal about her struggles in the past with body image and just maybe not eating enough at times, and how that has impacted her career with injury and illness and setbacks. And so to see her have that race in Miami earlier this year, have an incredible race, end up on the podium, announce her pregnancy, those are a lot of wins in a short period of time for her.
Yeah, and I think that's great that she can be open about some of the struggles that she had with restricting, and a lot of that was due to an injury where she found, she was on one of those machines that reduced her body weight, and she realized that when she had 10 pounds lighter, that she had no pain in her foot. And, all these things sort of lead into one and to the other. So, it was intentional, but sort of intentional to the fact that she wanted to reduce pain. And then it snowballs, as she has been quite forthright about. And so I think body image is part of this sport. It is a tricky conversation, and I think it is one that each individual, female athlete probably goes through at some point in time in their life and their career.
And we are going to touch more on that throughout this conversation, but it's not just pro athletes that you work with, right? You work with women of all levels. Is that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the company that I set up is a company called Fuelin. And so what we do is provide periodized or personalized nutrition programs. It syncs directly with Training Peaks, Dry Dot, and Final Surge. So athletes get a program, I guess, that is truly personalized to them, but also moves whenever their training moves. So they're told what to eat, when to eat, and how to eat, specifically around their training, which I think is the biggest difference. So I think there's about 1,300, 1,400 age group athletes now on the program, and there's a 50-50 split, male and female. And, you know, the other day we had a lady by the name of Crystal Clark, and Crystal's given permission to talk about her today. And, you know, she sent a really lovely note, but do you know what the Marathon des Sables is?
I did. I looked it up. 7 days, 250 kilometers or 155 miles for our American listeners in the Sahara Desert. I mean, incredible endurance feat. And I think, wait, you have to bring all your food, right?
Yeah, it's self-supported apart from rationed water. And, you know, Crystal started running in 2000. She did her first marathon in 2003, her first ultra in 2004, but then she stopped running because she had her son. And she stopped until 2017. So, you know, that's a decent hiatus, 10 years. She started running again. She's now run, 17 marathons, 25 ultras. She was saying that doesn't include her standard 50K runs that she does as training runs. And I was like, oh, God. She finished 4th in her division and she finished 29th female overall. And I think it was amazing because she reached out to us and told us this, and she was like, "Oh, I just want to thank Fuelin and Scott for helping fuel me on this." And I was like, "Oh my God, we didn't even know." And we haven't even set up the program necessarily to deal with sort of those types of races. But I mean, one of the quotes that really stood out for her, she said, "I think the biggest impact for me was realizing how much I was under eating on and around my long run days, and the impact, especially with doing back-to-back long runs." What it highlights to me is that there is still, despite everything that we talk about on podcasts, on social media and that, and from reputable sources, there is still a dearth of information and a lack of knowledge around what proper fueling looks like. This is the other thing, Haley, is like so many people focus on the event, but it's the training leading up to the event that makes the race a joy. That's the real sort of light bulb moment for a lot of athletes, I find, is when they're like, oh my God, what I do in training is my race plan. So if I practice my fueling, whether it's high carb, lower carb, higher fat, whatever you want to do, if I practice that in training, if I understand what my sweat rate is by doing sweat rate tests, weighing yourself before a session afterwards, you can then just start to work out the delta in terms of body weight percentage lost through fluid. You can then start to put together an effective hydration and fueling plan and keep repeating that in training till you get to the point where you're like, okay, this is just second nature. Now I feel amazing. And then you just take that into the race because you've been doing it for weeks and weeks and weeks. The race is actually just on autopilot, I guess, in that sense. And
1 day or 7 days, it works.
exactly. So all she did was follow the program, which again, we're not prescriptive in terms of like, you know, you eat chicken on this day and that. They have the flexibility to choose what the fuel is that they want to eat based on their dietary preference, and that based around what is the energy requirement. So what is the amount of protein, fat, carbohydrates, design it in that way so that, you know, you have the flexibility to cook whatever you feel like cooking on that day, as long as it meets the requirements that you need in order to thrive. I think the fact that Crystal did, I think, what is regarded as one of the hardest races on earth, I think firstly, credit to her more so than anyone. The fact that she managed to do that, I think, is absolute testament to her self-will and her ability as an athlete to sort of endure probably pure pain. I don't know how many ultras you've done, but I can't imagine doing
Done
7
one.
days. 7, I've done one as well.
It was like, I think it was like 15 years ago too. So that shows no. My co-host, Alyssa Godesky, she's done a lot of those. And I definitely admire people who can wake up and do that day after day after day, which actually is becoming a big thing in triathlon now. We'll talk more about the recovery that surrounds that if you do have multiple events in multiple days. But we have one more success story you wanted to share about an Ironman athlete. So this is a little bit more our meat and potatoes here.
Yeah, it's a bit more meat and potatoes. So a lovely lady called Sarah Seats. She was involved in a huge car accident in November last year, and she fractured her face, knocked out her teeth, fractured her spine, dislocated fingers. So pretty horrendous, actually. And she managed to start training again in January, which I think in itself is pretty remarkable. One of the biggest things was how can she actually consume her fuel, because she used to use blocks and chews, but she actually couldn't chew those anymore. because of the dental surgery. So we sort of had to work around some alternatives using carbohydrate liquids, gels, things like that, and then what type of food she could support during the week and during training. But the long and the short was that, she really did focus on her nutrition and her health. And she managed to set a PR in 70.3 an Ironman distance this year after 4 months of training. And I think really what it says to me is anything is possible. And
Yes, and just the creativity and finding a way, even with certain limitations, and figuring out new ways to get the calories she needed. And like you said, in training and in racing, very, very admirable. But congratulations to those women. I mean, it's great to hear those stories. So much variety. I know you've said this isn't the most glamorous topic. You're not your favorite one, but I know our listeners would love to know a little bit more about you and your background in sports and nutrition. Did you start as an athlete and then develop an interest in nutrition?
yeah, so obviously I'm Australian. I started in rugby union. So that was sort of my sport. So contact sports and whatnot. I actually was, I would say an average sort of endurance athlete, cross country, things like that. I actually started my academic career as a physiotherapist. So I studied physiotherapy at the University of Sydney. I then moved to England, did a master's in sports medicine at the University of London. Along that time, I worked in many professional sporting organisations with professional rugby, international cricket, worked at the Paralympics with the blind wrestlers, worked with British rowing with the women's heavyweight and lightweight rowing team, which was a pretty incredible experience. Yeah, you talk about food. I mean, they were pretty on it. I think now the lightweight doesn't actually exist in the Olympics. I think because of reasons related to that need to cut weight and whatnot. So I don't think they've got that category anymore, but certainly the heavyweight rowers certainly were in tune with what was required from a fueling perspective. And then from there, I went and did postgraduate studies in performance nutrition, and that led to going to work in the America's Cup professional sailing. That was fantastic. And then from there, I then moved further around the world. I went to live in Boston for a year in a biotech startup dealing with gut health, and then worked with the Toronto Maple Leafs in the NHL as their team nutritionist. During that time, I worked with Sarah Piano. So I worked with her from 2017 and under the guidance of Matt Dixon. And we had very successful time together. And I do credit Sarah with a lot of what Fuelin is today, a lot of the stuff that we tested on her, higher carb fueling, when higher carb fueling wasn't really a thing. Matt Dixon thought I was crazy, telling her to eat 100 grams of carbs on the bike. And I think 2019, she had a standout year, apart from, unfortunately, Kona, but she podiumed in every race that she completed. And then since then, it's sort of snowballed, and now I get to work with the likes of Holly Lawrence, Sky Munch, Ben Canute, Imogen Simmons, and last year worked with Jan Frodeno in his final year, which was pretty magic.
Since you have your finger on the pulse of nutrition, I am curious if you've heard of any new research or attention in women's specific nutrition. Anything new and exciting that you've seen come through the pipeline recently?
I wouldn't say it's exciting. I'd say it's probably a little bit of maybe debunking some myths is probably a better way of describing it. So this notion of cycling, manipulating your nutrition with regards to your menstrual cycle, the science behind it definitely supports that whilst in different stages of the menstrual cycle, there is different utilization of different substrates, i.e. carbohydrates and fat. More carbohydrates or better utilization in the follicular stage compared to in the luteal phase. However, what more recently has come out is that there has been probably a lack of evidence of any performance effect in doing that. It's not to say you can't do it. I think what it shows is that if you are going to do this, it's probably got to be more directed around your training as opposed to you directing your nutrition around your cycle. So what I mean by that is, if you want to go down this route of, I want to do high intensity training in the first part of my cycle and then lower intensity training in the second part of my cycle because it makes me feel better, then yes, you would manipulate your nutrition regarding that. So higher intensity, yes, you could use higher amounts of carbs. Lower intensity, you could use lower amounts of carbs, higher amounts of fat. That may work. It may make that individual feel better. However, when it comes to then performance, if you've got then a race in your luteal phase and you haven't been practicing higher carb fueling and you've been doing very low intensity training throughout that period, then I don't know what's going to happen to you in the race. And what we currently see in the research is that it's probably not going to be performance enhancing. And so I think that's something that is important for everyone to understand, that whilst the science is really interesting, maybe the practicality of it actually doesn't end up being that favorable for performance. Keep it simple. Like I was talking, I don't know if it was Holly or Sky, and she was like, oh my God, like I couldn't do that. Like I've got enough things on my plate at the moment, whether to think about changing my nutrition to a completely different style of eating halfway through the month. For them, it doesn't make sense because they're going to be racing, you know, at all times in the month. So they've got to be prepared. And I think it was Holly, actually. She was like, she just didn't want, psychologically, she didn't want that sort of going through her head. And I can understand that. And I think that same, like, yes, you may utilize protein in a different way in different parts of the cycle. And there is this notion of maybe reducing protein at certain parts and then increasing at certain parts. I'm like, God, that's getting complicated. Most people, most women in particular, don't hit their protein target, let alone thinking about changing it from one part to the next. So why not just focus on hitting your protein target and doing that consistently across the month, across several months, and see what happens? Like, to my knowledge, unless you've probably got one kidney or renal failure, you can take in quite a lot of protein and have zero negative side effects. And so the benefits of taking on more protein, they're fairly clear, from, you know, retention of lean body mass, improvements in body composition, satiation, improved immune function. You know, you go through it, better bones, you go through it, you would say, well, why would you drop your protein intake? Why not just keep it high and probably in that moderate to high all the time and see what happens, and keep it simple? That is why we keep protein high. We'll generally have it set probably around 2.2 grams. It's a very easy number for a lot of women to remember. Whatever their weight is in pounds, that should be roughly your amount of protein to eat on a daily basis. But the target we will give is usually that, but somewhere between 2 and 3 grams per kilo body weight.
If you're 130 pounds, for American audience, 130 grams of protein per day.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
I like that math.
It's a good starting point. It's a good starting point. Look, you can go up or down from there, but it's a really nice starting point and simple for people to get started with.
I think these are very, very good conversations. I'm always happy to hear that there is research being done, even if the outcome is, okay, we don't need to eat exactly to our menstrual cycles. It's great that someone is looking into that. So I appreciate that. When you look at different sources that you're getting information from, and, you know, our listeners, they're busy, they're triathletes, they're training for 3 sports, they are doing a lot of other things as well. What advice do you have for them on, like, making sure they're getting nutrition advice from a trusted source?
You know, looking at where the information is coming from. Now, a lot of people are going to use social media as a reference. I guess check who is talking. And that's often hard as well, because you will see a doctor talking about certain elements. I can think of a Dr. Brecker at the moment who, you know, talks quite a lot of rubbish around certain areas of health and performance. And so it's very, very difficult, to be honest. I'd probably have a look if they have any papers published. That would probably be a good start. We're going to talk about low energy availability and REDS, and, you know, in particular, there's 2 papers that athletes should have a look at, especially in relation to this, and it's the 2014 International Olympic Committee consensus statement, and then the more recently updated 2023 consensus statement, and that they're free to download off PubMed. Look, I think academic credentials do play a role here. I don't think they're the be or end all, because there are a lot of very smart individuals out there who haven't had the opportunity to go to university either, but are very well read. Listen to an individual and maybe listen to what they're saying. I think if that person is saying this is the only way, probably be pretty skeptical of that individual. Like, we're very pro carbohydrates. Do I believe it's the only way to fuel? No. There's plenty of people out there thriving on ketogenic diets and low carb, high fat. If it works for you, it works for you. I just think for the majority, it doesn't work that well. So if they're a zealot about what they're talking about, then I'd be pretty skeptical and probably look into them in a little bit more detail.
Probably applicable to nutrition advice and lots of other life advice.
Training, if that training method is the only training method that's going to get you results, I'd be like, yeah, probably not.
Scott, you've been working with endurance athletes 7 years, I guess, going on since you started working with Sarah Piampiano. But have you noticed that the endurance sports community, are they really receptive to the idea of a nutrition coach, or is there a stigma around that?
Well, firstly, I'll say Americans are very receptive.
Oh, interesting.
And American endurance athletes are very receptive. I think it's something about the American culture. You love a coach.
I will say, when I was working in public accounting and I was like an auditor and I said I had a triathlon coach, my colleagues, they thought I was lost my mind. They thought that was a waste of money, I will say, but look at me now.
Yeah, exactly. Look at you now. Who's laughing now? No, I think Americans are very open to the idea of having a coach, like having a training coach, a nutrition coach, a strength coach. And that's fantastic because that actually sort of fits with the professional sporting model. And that's what, in all the teams I've worked in, that's how you do it. You have your specialists in the areas and you come together and you talk, and that's what really makes the athlete thrive. So, we're working on it here in Australia. I think Australians have this sort of like, nah, she'll be right, mate. I'll just do it myself sort of attitude. And that's, I think, unfortunately, that is having a bit of a play on effect in Australian sport. I don't think we're crushing it like we used to. Like Australian sportsmen and women used to, absolutely be at the top of the game. And unfortunately, we're just not now. I think it's everyone else has caught up to that level and then accelerated. And unfortunately, I think the sort of, she'll be right attitude of Australia needs to change and sort of lean into a little bit more science and technology, perhaps. So in terms of Americans and in terms of endurance sports, I think there is a general thirst for nutrition coaching. I will say, though, that unfortunately, there is this stigma with working with nutrition coaches or dietitians that it's primarily for weight loss or improvements in body composition. And I'll give you the example. Sky Munch obviously had quite an interesting podcast last year where she talked about being fat shamed by her coach and told to lose, 4 or 5 kilos, 4 or 5 weeks out from world championships, despite coming, I think, 4th or 5th in the previous race. And that obviously all blew up. And I started working with Sky back in, April or May last year. And her coach, David Tilbury Davis, who I get on very well with, and David's a fantastic guy. His first reaction to her was, no, you don't need to work with a nutrition expert because you don't need to lose weight. And the irony with that was the very first conversation I had with Sky, she asked me, she said, do you think I need to lose weight? And I said, well, I think I need a little bit more information than that. But we went about being systematic and objective about it. And absolutely, I said to her, absolutely not. There is absolutely no reason for you to lose weight. This is about improving your health and ultimately improving your performance via fueling you correctly for the work that you're doing. And she was like, perfect. And David heard that. And obviously it provided a certain sense of relief to him that, yes, we were focusing on performance and her health rather than a focus on weight loss. And I don't think she's ever lost a pound under my guidance. And thankfully so. And I think what it proved was that you can be an incredible athlete without focusing on weight loss. And, her result in Kona, coming in 7th, and then 2 weeks later became the fastest American in history to complete an Ironman, and where she smashed Florida Ironman. And I think for Sky, it was months of work, of adherence, of consistency that brought those 2 results. And I think, again, that is often forgotten with athletes. They want this quick fix. They come onto a nutrition program or they want a fad diet that will provide very quick results. But that's the problem, is like, why not focus on what you're doing in terms of habit formation, improving the basics of your nutritional intake, i.e. lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, good quality protein, whether it's, whatever dietary preference you are, whether you're vegan, vegetarian, or omnivore, pescatarian, and building that base around health. And then depending on your volume of training and intensity of training, therefore your caloric requirements, you layer on extra energy, most likely in the form of carbohydrates.
And this quick fix idea, I mean, that is what everyone needs. I feel like a lot of triathletes are really busy. Especially when we look at age group women, they're more likely to shoulder more household and caregiving duties. They could also be working a traditional job. They're training for triathlon. So these are athletes with really demanding schedules. So how do you convince these kind of athletes that it's worth it to take the time to strategize finding the time to eating enough when they might be having 15 minutes and that's like all they have and they just got to eat what's there?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And I can fully understand what you're saying, because my partner does a lot of, as much as I try and help, she does an incredible amount with the children. And you realize how much time it takes up. So I guess when we create the program, it's designed to try and remove guesswork. Again, that's probably the two things that the professional athletes will talk about, is like it just removes the guesswork. So if you can become accustomed to, we use a color coding system, which is like red is lower amounts of carbs, yellow is moderate, green is high. If you can just see those colors and go, okay, I know what a red meal is. A red lunch is a beautiful salad with, chicken or tuna or beef or whatever it is that you want to eat with it. And that's what gets me the amounts that I'm being told I need. That's great. You see green and you're like, happy days, I'm having my favorite pasta. Great. And so it simplifies your life in the fact that you become conditioned to the colors and you know what meals to eat based around that. I guess, Haley, the thing you said there that really resonates with me is like, these women are busy and they are training. And the training is what takes a lot of the time. But if you don't get your nutrition right to fuel that training, the training is going to be horrible and it's not going to be enjoyable. And you're going to lose the will pretty quick. You're not going to get the results that your coach is expecting or you're expecting, and things fall apart. And so it's probably shifting the focus a little bit more maybe on yourself and saying, okay, well, if I don't put fuel in my body, how am I expected to do all this training and not get so tired that I can't then do the other things in my life that are probably necessities? The training's a non-essential, I guess, isn't it? Unless you're a professional athlete. We choose to do this stuff. So at least try and make it enjoyable by being fueled enough to function at your utmost and at your prime. Because I think that's the mistake so many make. They're like, oh, I'm just not going to eat. And, I don't know if you've ever been in that stage where, when you're not eating, it has huge impact on your psychological state. You can look at the research and it's pretty clear that you can go down that depressive mode through lack of energy or low energy availability. And that is just one sign or symptom of low energy availability and REDS.
Yeah, I want to talk more about low energy availability and REDS, and maybe just roll this into the short-term signs of underfueling. What should we be looking out for?
Well, I touched on it there. So low mood is one. And again, like with these signs and symptoms, a lot of people will be like, oh, I've got that. Like low mood, irritability, poor sleep patterns. But with the poor sleep, like if you're getting night sweats, that can be a sign or symptom of low energy availability. It can also indicate some other more serious aspects. So if you are experiencing night sweats, then please see your doctor. It could also indicate, say, perimenopause or menopause as well. So several things it could look at. Fluctuations in training, so sort of inconsistent performance, low energy or lack of energy, frequent illness is another one. So if you're constantly getting sick now, I will say that if you've got young children, I have two very young children and they're always sick and I'm always sick and I've never been so sick in my life. So, again, use common sense here. If you know that you are fueling right, but you've got young children, you're getting sick, then it's probably that. So they're probably the common signs and symptoms. Now you then throw in, as a female, loss of menstrual cycle or irregular menstrual cycle is a telltale sign that all women should be aware of. If that is starting to happen, or if you lose your cycle, that is probably a very good indication that low energy availability is part of your life. Frequent or recurrent bone stress injuries, so whether they're stress reactions or stress fractures, it is highly likely that low energy availability is underpinning those bone injuries. Yeah, they're probably the main ones.
How quickly can you fix this? I mean, is it as much as like going and getting one good meal and like, okay, now we're working better, we're not backsliding? Like, when do you get to a point where it's like, okay, I need professional help?
So there's a cool study, and they applied a 300 calorie a day surplus to individuals who'd lost their cycle, and there was varying degrees of success. And one thing I will say is that if you have lost your cycle for a long time, it will likely take longer to get it back. But what this study showed was that as little as 300 calories extra per day actually brought back the cycle in the majority of the women in around 30 days. So it is very possible to improve areas like that, and probably your cycle is a good indicator of maybe what your internal health is. Things like that is possible, but should you be doing that on your own? Yeah, you could try and do it, but I would sort of say you might save a lot of time and angst and sort of anguish by just reaching out to a healthcare professional and sort of saying, do you think I'm eating enough, or maybe I need some help with my fueling in and around training, because I feel like I am suffering some of these signs and symptoms of low energy availability. And then the bigger paradigm of this is what we call REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. And that's sort of the acronym, I guess, for what encompasses what was once called the female athlete triad. So the female athlete triad was loss of menstrual cycle, bone injuries, and low energy availability. And that changed in 2014 to then encompass men, because they realized that men were also impacted by low energy availability. And so it also took into account a whole larger range of physiological functions, signs and symptoms. So from the brain to the heart to the immune function and so on. They realized that so many different parts of the body system were impacted by a low energy availability.
And you mentioned those the IOC papers, what the 2014 International Olympic Committee did change that terminology from female athlete triad to REDS. And then the new update in 2023, what were some other those changes that came out in 2023?
The biggest thing was that if you think of an infographic, and I would encourage all the listeners to go and find this paper, and maybe you can put the links up because they are available to the public. The original paper had REDS at the center of the infographic. So it had the acronym or the diagnosis at the center with all the signs and symptoms around that. And then they had another one, which was like, what is the consequences of this? So low energy output, poor strength, poor performance, low mood, What they did in 2023 was actually change those infographics, and it was a subtle change, but they moved low energy availability to the center of these infographics. So what it then put the focus on was low energy availability is underpinning all these physiological signs and symptoms, and low energy availability is resulting in all these consequences. And so the shift in focus now is being recognized that low energy availability is what really underpins REDS.
During your competitive season, you're obviously training more at certain times. It sounds like, or suggests people adjust their nutrition with their training. So I assume that means during the competitive season, you are going to be encouraging people to eat more at certain times, eat more carbohydrates, eat, a different mix of macronutrients than at other times. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. One thing I've realized in the off season, triathletes don't really take an off season. They still tend to train fairly hard. And that's been a learning curve, like just looking at, how much volume or how much intensity drops off. The intensity might drop off, but the volume might not necessarily. So you still need to fuel that accordingly. And I'll give you another example of this is, zone 2 training. I think a lot of people think zone 2, I don't need to eat anything on this. It's very low. I mean, if you're cycling, Hayley, what's your normalized power on like a zone 2 ride? If I'm allowed to ask that. Can I ask that?
I want to say like 100 watts, but I feel like that's going to get me in trouble. No, probably a little bit more. I'd say like 140 to 160 watts.
So you're still going to be
I love
burning.
going easy. I love going easy, man. I'm like 70 to 100, way too much. I shouldn't even say this in real life.
That's very good. So you just no, but even if you're pushing that power, like your caloric expenditure is what, 600 calories an hour, something like that.
That's a
500, 5
lot.
to 600. Like, and that's not a whole lot of power that you're pushing out. So then you go up and you go, okay, well, there are plenty of women out there that will be pushing higher numbers than that in zone 2. And even if they're pushing the numbers you're saying, you've still got a decent caloric expenditure. And if you're going out for a 3 or 4 hour ride, and let's say you're burning 500 calories an hour, you could end up being in a serious hole at the end of that. If A, you don't eat anything on that ride, and B, you don't consume any food or fuel after the ride. What's really important here is that regardless of whatever training you're doing, you have to be thinking about, okay, what do I require in order to support my body, regardless of the intensity. Yes, higher intensity training, you're probably changing the types of fuel you're using. So we would be recommending more refined carbohydrates in those cases because A, they're easier for the body to utilize, and B, easier to get down. You can consume more of those types of carbs than whole foods. But in those zone 2 training sessions, don't be afraid of using whole foods as long as they've got the calories in them to support whatever you're doing. And we tend to lean on sort of fuel the work or the training you're doing specifically. So look at that. And then maybe if you want to try and control your nutrition outside of that, that's where potentially you control the deficit or the surplus or the maintenance calories. And so what that does is shift that focus from, you know what, I've got a 2-hour ride, but I'm trying to lose weight. I think I might just drink water only on this ride because that will provide a big calorie deficit. All that does is probably interfere with the performance of the session. By the end of the session, you're absolutely stuffed. You come off the bike, you feel terrible. You go and eat 3 pizzas and whatever else because you're so hungry that you might as well not have done the ride because now you're actually in a caloric surplus. If you actually ate during the session, fueled it appropriately, felt really great, and then came off, ate a quality recovery meal, and then controlled what you were doing throughout the rest of the day and the week, my argument would be you're going to have a much better result.
What about if there is a disruption to your training for something like an injury, something that actually does maybe require you to sit on the couch for a little time or take a little bit of an off season, or illness? I mean, that's a little bit more short term, hopefully, but I think that sometimes people think they need to be trying to stay race fit even when they don't have a race on the near horizon. Is that smart?
Look, again, I don't think being race fit all year round is a good idea because I think it can put a lot of people under a lot of stress, especially if you are in a lower body composition state. I think that can cause some issues. So I think that ability to fluctuate in line with whatever your A and B races are, I think is a good strategy because it allows you to sort of have a little bit more flexibility. You mentioned about illness or injury, and I think, again, we'll focus on injury here. Again, putting on my physiotherapy hat, sports medicine hat, it's like the thing that we used to see a lot, and I still see, is that athletes get injured and they're like, oh, I don't need to worry about nutrition. And I'm like, actually, this is probably the most important time you need to focus on your nutrition, especially if you've got a serious injury. So if you've got a serious orthopedic injury, let's say you broke a bone or you did a knee or something like that, and you're going in for surgery, you certainly want to be focused on your nutrition because your body is going to be trying to heal itself. So something that a lot of athletes don't know, and I've talked about recently, is that you can do like a carbohydrate load going into orthopedic surgery, and that will improve the outcome of that surgery in the short term. So if you think about it, like you go in for major surgery, they tell you to do a fast for 12 hours beforehand. So you're going into surgery in potentially a glycogen depleted state, or at least a non-optimal state. If you actually load it up, then despite even with the fast, you're going to be in a better state and have more energy available to allow your body to recover because resting metabolic rate's going to go up whenever you're injured. So the common mistake a lot of athletes will make also if they're just injured is restricting calories because they're thinking, I don't want to get fat. It's actually the wrong strategy. You would be better off taking in a surplus of calories at the time that you're injured for a short period of time. I'm not saying indefinitely, but certainly to allow or fuel the body and allow the body to help itself sort of accelerate that healing process. And so that's something that a lot of athletes don't think about. They don't think about the intake of protein when they're injured. Again, taking in high amounts of protein will keep you satiated. So if you're worried about total calorie intake, you could take in extra protein, keep yourself feeling full so you're not snacking all the time, but also assist that preservation or hopefully preserve some of that lean mass that you've worked so hard to sort of achieve.
When we look at the demographics of endurance sports, especially for women, I've heard there's a lot of young people coming in, which I'm very excited about that. But there are a lot of older people and a lot of older women. We've talked about perimenopause and menopause, and Feisty Media does have an entire menopause podcast called Hit Play Not Pause. That is fantastic. Celine Yeager is incredible. So I don't want to get into it too much, but there are different nutritional requirements at different points of life. And are there any things that someone who is perimenopausal or menopausal should be paying attention to?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, and this sort of, I think this, again, I'll go back to the let's keep it simple mantra. So the more recent science has shown that older people require high amounts of protein, and that's really cool. It doesn't mean that older people are special in relation to they need necessarily more protein than younger people. They just need high amounts of protein. The old thinking was, oh, you're old. You don't need as much protein because you don't do as much. But if you actually look at it, the amount that's being recommended is actually the same amount I would recommend to a 22-year-old. So you're probably, again, sitting in that 2 to 3 grams per kilo of body weight. So just keep it simple. When you're young, consume 2 to 3 grams per kilo of body weight. When you're old, consume 2 to 3 grams per kilo of body weight. You don't have to go and do something magical and like, think about changing things up. You just need to be eating consistently higher amounts of protein, especially if you're performing any form of athletic activity or exercise activity and trying to maintain lean muscle mass, trying to increase lean muscle mass. So that would be sort of my advice. Yes, you could argue that an older person may benefit even more from even higher protein. And there is some really interesting studies where, they've overfed older individuals, like 70-year-olds, sort of 70, 80 grams of protein in a sitting. And that's had run-on effects in terms of what we call muscle protein synthesis and improvements in that. But then just, a few months ago, they did a study which showed feeding younger athletes 100 grams of protein could also be beneficial. So what we're now seeing is there really a difference? And male, female, I don't think there's really a difference as far as I'm aware in the science. It's just eat more protein, especially if you're an athlete and you're trying to be your best. That would be the simple message. So if you are older, take a leaf out of maybe your children's book, who, if they're doing athletic endeavors and they're eating more protein, start to copy them and do that. If you already are eating high amounts of protein, there's probably not much you need to change.
And how do you feel about the source of the protein? How do you feel about, these like lab grown meats and, plant-based protein? Is it different than animal-based protein?
So the old way of thinking, again, and I think we've all been guilty of this because of some of the short-term studies, was looking at animal versus plant protein. And it was always, animal protein's a lot better because of the bioavailability, the way in which the body absorbs it, the amino acid sort of composition. More recently, that's sort of been disproven. So as long as you eat a lot of plant protein and the equivalent amount of protein within that plant protein matches the animal protein, then you will see similar effects in terms of strength, muscle mass retention, or gains. The take-home message for vegan or plant-based athletes is you can get similar effects from your protein sources. You just need to eat more of it in order to get the matched amount of protein, the matched amount of amino acids. So often plant proteins will have different compositions of amino acids. In particular, one amino acid called leucine. So the leucine content in a lot of plant proteins is a little bit lower. In order to tend to match the equivalent in the animal protein, often you blend protein sources of plants. So if you are using, say, a plant supplement, like a plant protein supplement, look for something that has probably more than one source of plant protein in it. So pick something that might have like fava bean, pumpkin, brown rice, pea, soy, any of those in it, because what that will do is, because there's a combination, you'll probably get the correct amino acid profile. And again, as long as you're eating enough of it, you'll be fine. In terms of the lab grown proteins, I honestly don't have an opinion because I don't know enough about them. It seems a little weird. I think when I have looked at plant proteins, like fake meat burgers and things like that, what I have noticed is the cost seems to represent or reflect the ingredients within them. So the very cheap plant meat alternatives tend to have a lot of questionable oils and ingredients associated in the label, whereas the more expensive ones seem to be, if you want to call it, a little bit cleaner. They tend not to have as many preservatives and sort of alternative oils in them. And that would be something that I would just look at.
We touched on this a little bit earlier about people who start triathlon or endurance sport with the goal of losing weight. We've talked a lot about eating for performance and making sure we eat enough, but there is a segment of our endurance sports population that is trying to lose weight. How do you feel about weight loss drugs, Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound? How do you feel about that into like the endurance sports lifestyle?
They're interesting drugs, aren't they? Designed originally for diabetics, and then the result was extreme weight loss. I think when you look at the way in which they work by decreasing hunger and increasing satiation, I think what my initial thoughts with this is, if someone is training for, say, Ironman 70.3, you could run the risk of then low energy availability and those signs and symptoms of REDS if that individual just doesn't feel hungry, although their body actually requires that amount of fuel that they just physically can't get in because the drug is doing its thing. So I think in that sense, like, it's not to say it couldn't work. I think you would probably want to work with a healthcare professional to really manage the way in which you're doing that and ensure that you are at least fueling the key sessions appropriately, and then managing your total intake, especially your macronutrient split, around that to try and maximize your health first and foremost. I think you would really be focusing on the health of the individual and then probably looking at performance. The other thing that about those drugs is, yes, they provide a pretty substantial weight loss. I mean, when they're prescribed, they're meant to be prescribed with a lifestyle management program. But the idea is that individuals are then meant to be focusing on maybe the reasons why they put on weight in the first place. So starting to look at what is your nutritional habits, what is your usual nutritional intake, because if you take this drug and you continue just eating crap, it's probably not going to have the desired effect, especially when you come off it. And my understanding, and I think it's very early days, some early trials where the individuals have come off the drug and then rebounded and put the weight back on. So like most diets and short-term fixes, there's always a repercussion. And usually when you put weight back on, it's usually plus 20%.
So if someone does come to you and they want to lose weight, what advice do you have for them? Like, what kind of a plan do you suggest? Is there a way to do that and do endurance sports, or should they be working with, a different kind of nutrition coach?
No, so we looked at the stats. I think it's 94% of athletes who come on to Fuelin have a weight loss goal. So they always put their target body weight lower than their current body weight for over 90% of the athletes. So there's certainly a desire for athletes to want to lose weight. Now, how much weight that is, that's what often makes me sort of smile, is like, someone might have 2 pounds less. And it's like, really? Is 2 pounds really going to make a difference? Or wouldn't you be better off just focusing on feeling really bloody good and training and fueling everything appropriately? And that message often gets across to athletes. Like, they're like, "Oh, yeah, why am I chasing 2 pounds where if I actually just ate and felt really great and smashed all my training, that's just a better way to be sort of, going about life. I think you then have the other athlete that you hinted at, the ones that really do need to lose weight purely from a health perspective. I think it's absolutely fine. I think it's great that if they've got that ambition to lose a amount of body fat or body weight, and it is body fat that they're trying to lose, because that ultimately is going to make them a healthier individual. I don't think they should be made to feel bad about that. And I think the fact that they're trying to improve their health and probably their performance by doing a sport like triathlon, I think that's quite admirable. How you do that is through process. So focusing on habits, focusing on, as I mentioned, like what does your daily nutritional intake look like? What do you eat on a daily basis, and how is that either interfering, or how is that sort of championing the ability for you to achieve your goal? And if you strip it all back, if you remove ultra processed and processed foods, junk food, things like that, if you remove that from your diet, you're probably going to be removing a huge source of calories, first and foremost, because the caloric density of those foods is extreme. So if you then focus on eating lots of vegetables, and something we'll talk about within Fuelin, we talk about fists of veggies. Athletes, they're always like, what is this fist of veggies? And, it's trying to encourage six to nine serves, or 6 to 9 fists of leafy greens on a daily basis. And I can guarantee you not many athletes do that ever. But when you start focusing on it, you start to realize how few vegetables maybe you're eating on a daily basis. And just by focusing on that and repositioning your habits and what your focus is for those habits, you can start to make meaningful change. So you're increasing fiber intake, you're reducing total calorie density, but you're improving satiation because you're eating more fibrous foods. Micronutrient density goes up. You then layer in your proteins of choice, whatever your dietary preference is, and they're whole food options. Yes, okay, for vegans and vegetarians, maybe they have to opt for some of the tofus or these plant-based meats. But in saying that, you can still eat a lot of beans, pulses, grains. They're going to provide some sources of protein, lots of carbohydrates. For omnivores, focusing on good quality cuts of, red meat, fish, chicken and whatnot, then I think when you start doing that on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, in line with what you require, then you start to see results. It's just, Haley, it's just not that sexy, is it? In terms of, gee, that sounds like a lot of hard work. Can't you just give me a shake and I can do that and drink that for 7 days? Well, yeah, you can, but that's not going to give you long-lasting results.
Yeah, I love boring things though that get you there. So that's like right up my alley. That's why no one rides 100 watts with me. And while we eat fistfuls of vegetables. No.
Doesn't every triathlete love boring things? I mean, you think about it, you sit on a trainer for 2 hours and you're like happy to do that, but you're not happy to eat quality food.
And food doesn't have to be boring. That's not the right word. Not the right word to use. But yeah, like you said, it's not immediate.
Food is glorious. And I think that's one of the things I do love to read, is that when athletes are like, oh my God, I started cooking again. And I just enjoy cooking. And I know it can be a drag. And again, it's thinking of the way you approach life. There are so many individuals in this world who don't get to eat quality food. So if, I've got to eat my vegetables, or I get to eat my vegetables, it's a play on words, but it's a very powerful flip that can really transform your life and the way in which you approach nutrition.
I do want to ask, because our podcast is sponsored by Precision Hydration, and electrolytes just seem to be big right now. Why is everyone so obsessed with electrolytes?
That's a good question. I love Precision and Andy and the team. They're great guys, and we've worked with them for many, many years, and I love their products. I love their carb products. I guess in terms of sodium, look, yes, there is a lot of hysteria over the sodium amounts. I think I'll choose my words carefully here. I think sodium is required. Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt. Sodium is the key electrolyte that will help with hydration. The amounts that you require is going to vary depending on the individual. You have to remember that you get sodium in your day-to-day food, and especially in America where food is fairly heavily salted. Be aware that sodium intake can be achieved through usual dietary practices. Now, if you are an extremely heavy sodium sweater and you are always covered in salt crusts at the end, then you may benefit from an increased amount of sodium, especially for those individuals who are racing long duration. So events certainly lasting more than 4 hours, increased amount of sodium intake with your fluids and carbohydrates could be warranted to help prevent things like symptoms of, say, like cramping. For events under that, it's hard to say. At the moment, the science doesn't necessarily support a huge increase in sodium, but I do know for individual athletes, they benefit and they feel better on it. The amount of sodium you need to take in is going to vary from individual to individual. Even if you get your sweat sodium test completed, which I would advise a lot of athletes to get, especially if they struggle with things like cramping, that amount that is explained to you, you don't need to consume 100% of that in your fluids because you're obviously going to be taking in sodium on a day-to-day basis. It's a bit like, if you have a sweat rate of 1 liter per hour, you don't need to replace 1 liter of fluid. You could probably replace 60 to 80% of that and be absolutely fine. So I think in terms of sodium, it is an individualized process, and it's an individualized sort of concept that you can work out by yourself. You can use calculators. Precision Hydration has a really good one on their website. We have one built into Fuelin where athletes can learn and understand their sort of hydration requirements that they practice in training, and then they take that into the race. It's still one of those areas in science that I think we're still learning. Dr. Alan McCubbin, he works with Fuelin. He's a researcher and a lecturer down at Monash University in Melbourne. He's published, I think, 30 odd studies. His area of expertise is sweat and hydration. And it's still fairly conflicting what we see in the research with regards to sodium and fluid replacements. And so I think the real take-home message here is, and again, I'm not saying no, you don't need sodium, or yes, you do need sodium. I'm probably like, it's an individual sort of circumstance. And I think as an athlete, you need to sort of work out what fits with you. And the way you work that out is by practicing in training and working out fluid amounts, sodium amounts, carbohydrate amounts, practicing that in your race pace intensity sessions so that you dial that in. And so when it comes to the race, you have no doubt that you need 300 milligrams of sodium per bottle with 70 grams of carbs in it. And you're also going to eat 2 packets of Cliff Blocks and 1 gel every hour. And that's your plan. And you've worked that out through repetitive training.
I will add that years ago, I had a friend who was doing a research study and asked me to do a sweat test. And I was like, oh, I'm going to be like the heaviest sweater, the saltiest sweater you've ever tested. And I did the test and she's like, you're totally normal. There's nothing exceptional about you. So I'm glad I have that because it does help me a little bit, like not get a little too worked up about it. I thought I was exceptional, but I wasn't.
I'm sure you are exceptional, but the point being is that for probably 70 to 80% of individuals, that they're probably very similar to yourself in terms of that sweat sodium concentration. I think where it gets very interesting is what we don't know, because the research just isn't there, is what happens in longer duration events for individuals, and does increased amounts of sodium increase blood volume? We have an inkling around that probably is the case. We just don't have the research to show it. And so again, lack of evidence doesn't necessarily mean evidence of lack of effect. What we see in the field is probably years ahead of what we know in the research. Research often catches up to what athletes are doing. I think what Andy and their team are doing, I think it's great. I think this awareness of the need for proper fueling, proper hydration strategies, I think sodium and carbohydrates are part of those strategies. And so I think increasing the awareness and the work that they're doing with professional and age group athletes, I think it's admirable. And as I said, I use their products. The flavor profile on their carbs is great. It's minimal. You don't want something sickly sweet when you're out After doing 4 hours of exercise, you sort of want something very minimal. So I take my hat off to them.
And I do have one more question. We alluded to this early when we were talking about Crystal and MDS and these back-to-back racing days, which I think have gotten a lot more popular in endurance sports. We see this, the USAT Multisport Festivals coming up, and I have athletes who are doing like 6 and 7 races in like 5 days. I mean, it's so cool. They're all different kinds: duathlons, aquathons, super sprints, and triathlons, and relays, and draft legal and non-drafting. And even myself, earlier this year, I kicked off my year by running at Disney, at Walt Disney World. I did the Dopey Challenge, where I did a 5K, 10K, half marathon, and marathon on consecutive days. And it was shockingly fun. Do you have suggestions just as far as recovering when you have another session coming up, maybe the same day, next day? And this could be a race, or even if you were trying to stack up 2 harder back-to-back training sessions. Do you have suggestions for what athletes should be focused on in that kind of period?
Yeah, I think, again, we come back to total calorie intake. I think it's so important. Definitely don't skip. If you've got back-to-back sessions, you want to be trying to replenish fuel stores as quickly as possible. So taking in some carbohydrates, depending on, again, total volume on the week and total volume on the day is going to probably dictate the amount of carbohydrates that you're going to take in after that first session. Guidelines will have you somewhere in the 1.5 to sort of 3 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates in that feed, which I think is fairly hefty. For a lot of individuals, probably don't require that, especially if their overarching goal maybe is some body composition goals within. So, but certainly taking on good amount of protein, a fairly, somewhere in that 50 to 100 grams of carbs is probably going to serve you really well. So I think that's really, really, really important. Total calories for that day. And then probably, again, if you've got a back-to-back session, certainly that feed in the evening is going to be really important, because you're going into a fast, in inverted commas, by going to sleep. So you certainly don't want to have a low carbohydrate meal in the evening if you're going to be trying to perform the next day in the morning. And certainly the next morning, taking in, again, another breakfast or another snack before that session would certainly make sense as well. I think back-to-back sessions, sort of outside of the realm of nutrition, I guess, you'd be using modalities like ice baths. You're not worried about the short-term sort of impact on adaptation. So using ice baths to sort of reduce DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness, if it can improve that type of feeling, then I would be leaning on that. Active recovery is really important. That's been shown to be just as effective as ice baths. So that's just sitting on a bike for 10 minutes after you finish the race. And I know a lot of athletes never do that. They never sort of get back on their trainer. Although you will see I do see more and more of the pros, and if you watch the Tour de France, you'll see the cyclists, they'll come off their bike, they'll have their little thing, and then they're straight back on their bike, actually recovering. And so I wouldn't underplay that. And there is some really cool science on active recovery, just 10 minutes of easy cycling after a session, after a race. Sleep becomes paramount. I think whatever sleep you can get in between multi-day races is very important. So maybe using some supplementation. You might use melatonin in those cases to try and improve the onset of sleep for those individuals who maybe have these multi-stage events. And then I think there's some other supplements you could certainly use, but you wouldn't just use them in races. You would certainly want to practice this. Things like tart cherry concentrate, beta-alanine, bicarb soda, L-theanine, as I mentioned, melatonin as well. They're all sort of supplements that could be advantageous in the short term and allow you to sort of do, if you think of beta-alanine, bicarb, betaine, they allow you to do sort of repeated sprint efforts multiple times. So supplements like that, we do use with some athletes, and some athletes respond very, very well to them.
Okay. No, this is very cool. I'm actually like giving myself a pat on the back for my walk around Epcot, my Mickey Mouse shaped pretzel. I wasn't that far off.
Exactly. Just turn your legs over and eat something. And if that's a pizza, it's fine. Look, as I said, think about zone 2, you burn 500 calories an hour. I can guarantee you probably were pushing a lot harder in a race. Even if you were taking in 120 grams of carbs an hour, that's only 480 calories. Think about that. You're still in a deficit. That's the point. So I think it's for women, it's about 160 watts for 2 to 3 hours. And for men, it's like 200 or 220 watts. If you're pushing those numbers for 3 hours or more, you're certainly going to benefit from at least 90 grams an hour of carbs as an intake. And so that's probably a starting point. Now, can you go above that? Maybe. Is it advantageous? Not sure. Anecdotally, yeah, definitely. Those athletes that push bigger numbers, I can tell you now, they certainly take in 120 grams of carbs an hour, and some of them are a little bit more. I think we're still learning. It's such an individualized and sort of ongoing journey, I think, into nutrition. And what's super exciting about being in this space at this point in time is that there is now this sort of renewed focus on nutrition. And I think that's so cool that people are like, you know what, you need to fuel. Actually, yeah, you do need to eat, or you do need to consume calories on the bike. And I think that renewed focus now, or that new focus, I should say, that actually fueling is super important and it improves performance. And the subsequent, runoff effect on that is that it actually probably has an improvement in your health to avoid all those signs and symptoms of low energy availability and REDS. I think that's a real positive place for nutrition to be in at this point in time.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for sharing so much of your time and your wisdom. We will keep that in mind, going for that performance and ultimately health as we look forward to the rest of the season.
No, thank you so much, Haley, for giving me the opportunity to chat with you today. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much to Scott for coming on and sharing that knowledge. And Haley, you were telling me earlier that you've already made some changes to your diet based on this interview, right?
It is so funny, Alyssa, because when he said that, confirmed that for a 130-pound woman who's in endurance sports should be trying to eat about 130 grams of protein per day, in addition to, carbs and fat as well. But that 130 grams of protein number kind of stuck with me. And so I have been paying attention recently to actually read some labels and how much protein is in each of these items that I usually eat. I was very surprised to learn there is protein in my oatmeal, which I was pleasantly surprised, but it's so hard to get to 130 grams. And I had chicken for 2 meals the first day and I was at 90, and which is still pretty good, but it's still wow. And so it has gotten me to get some snacks that are a little higher protein, some yogurt. I like yogurt snacks, and then just adding cheese to things has some protein, and then adding in more chicken. I got some beef the other day that I'm just thinking about it a little bit more, and I don't know, maybe that's actually what's making me feel better. It's not just the weather, but I think the weather in combination with probably eating a little bit more has been good. So yeah, sometimes you learn everything, even when you're the interviewer.
Well, I'm excited to hear that the snow has left Bozeman. Knock on wood, hopefully it's for good. Yeah, you're eating the good thing about upping protein is that it's all delicious things. So that's not usually a hard task to do, and that you're feeling good. And Haley, next week we will chat all about everyone's burning beginner Q&A questions.
I'm excited about this. I love being the one who gets to give the advice. So back on that side next week. Can't wait for it, but I'll talk to you later, Alyssa.
Bye, Haley.
You've been listening to the IronWomen podcast hosted by Haley Chura and Alyssa Godesky.
IronWomen is a production of Feisty Media and is edited by Lydia Russell and produced by Ella Natition.
Head to livefeisty.com to find more podcasts, stories, and fresh perspectives.
Thanks for listening.